This week, Reverend Wendy continues her series, Your Spiritual Journey, which is a metaphysical and symbolic look at the Christmas story. Reverend Wendy explores the messy and unpredictable nature of spiritual awakening, as well as the importance of honoring our personal spiritual gifts.
So, how ready do you feel for Christmas? Feel ready? Ready? Oh, that was a very mixed response, but that's okay, because we're going to be talking about Christmas not from the standpoint of all of the outer stuff that is kind of commercially oriented, if you will, but we want to continue to take a deep dive and a deeper look at the symbols of the Christmas story and what it means to us in our journey spiritually. Because when you really think about it, what we are celebrating is a birthday, right? We're celebrating the birthday of the man that came to be called Jesus the Christ. And when you think about that, it puts a little bit of a different spin on it, the right spin on it, if you will, that it is a story about birth, it is a story about transformation, and what we look at in our spiritual teaching and practice is that this story is our story. That there are elements of the story that are historical, there are elements of the story that are allegorical, if you will, but all of the story is also our story in a very deep, metaphysical, mystical way. And so we've been unpacking the various elements of the Christmas story and kind of looking at them and saying, well, what might this reveal about my journey, about my unfoldment? We've taken a look at the shepherds, we've taken a look at the angels, we've taken a look at Mary and Joseph, and we're going to continue to go a little bit deeper today as we look at the story of the wise men and Herod and the star and the manger. And what I want to ask you to do is to put aside the fact that you've heard all of these parts of the story many, many times before, and try to listen to them with new ears and listen to them from a metaphysical and metaphorical standpoint. So after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So we're celebrating and remembering together the birth of a child whose light and message and teaching, whether you completely agree with it, disagree with it, or only partially agree with it, you cannot deny that his life and his message has had an enormous influence on all of us, And so who was this man? What are all the pieces of this story, and how do they relate to our journey? How do they intersect with who we are and what's going on in our lives? You know, I can't help but think of the very act of birth itself. We're celebrating his birthday, right? I can't help but think of the very physical act of birth and how messy and dangerous that act actually is. And yet I believe with all my heart and soul that though Jesus was not born of a virgin, he was born in the same way that you and I are, that absolutely positively Mary and Joseph prepared for his birth. Even though it was in a manger, even though there was no room where? In the inn, and so they wound up in the manger, there was a certain element of preparation, a certain element of anticipation. And all of these are woven into our very journey of unfoldment and spiritual growth itself. There are 5 ideas, 5 pointers I want to share with you from the Christmas story that echo what goes on inside of us. And the very first one is this, is that our journey begins with an opening. Our journey begins with a sort of needing to make room. Have you noticed that stepping onto a spiritual path requires some preparation? Have you noticed that stepping onto a spiritual path requires a certain amount of separation from what was before in your life to what is trying to come forth here and now? There are certain things you leave behind so that you have room within to take on new things to bring forth. There are ideas, are there not, that we separate from. Ideas of lack and limitation and judgment and separation. We separate from these ideas as we walk a spiritual path together, that we might make room and take on a new consciousness. And in taking on that new consciousness, we too are born anew or born again. There's a certain need to make the room for that, though, right? Though I didn't read it in this part of the Christmas story that I shared with you this morning, we know that the reason Jesus was born in the manger was because there wasn't any room in the inn. What I know is that in my life, it is so easy for me to get in that place with all the worldly concerns and all of the responsibilities and find that, oh my goodness, I have left no room for my spiritual practice, for my meditation practice, for my mindfulness practice, for my practice of conscious gratitude. Can you relate to any part of that? You're very quiet this morning. Maybe that's because you can completely relate to it, right? To be in this teaching is not something that we just do when we walk in this room on a Sunday morning. It is what we do all the rest of the time when we are not here. It's like the person who left Catholicism and said to me in our Unity membership class, in some ways it was so much easier back then because it was very clear what was expected of me, and if I just did those things and showed up at Mass the right number of times, I was good. But this Unity stuff is so daily. This is an honest comment that was made to me in the membership class many years ago, and I didn't have the heart to tell her, well, it's actually momently. It's not just daily, right? So there's this separation of certain ways of being that we might empty ourselves out, if you will, and open ourselves up to a more spiritually advanced way of being. And there is quite literally the need to make room for that. I shared a quote at first service, or reading at first service, with this idea of our path, our journey, and it comes from Carl Jung. If the path you are on is clear, you're probably on someone else's path. If the path you're on is clear, you're probably on someone else's path. That should evoke laughter, and I think it should also give us some comfort, like, okay, so it's not going to be so clear-cut. It's not going to be so clear-cut. And that leads me into point number 2. And we've touched upon this a little bit in some of the other previous weeks, that the journey often begins in a very messy and often dangerous and chaotic way. Can I have an amen to that? Amen. The journey often begins in a really messy and sometimes dangerous If you think about birth, it's messy and it's dangerous. And there's aspects of birth that can be very chaotic, very unpredictable. And this is very true of our spiritual journey as well. Some of you may be students of the spiritual teacher Byron Katie or Eckhart Tolle. And if you know anything about their awakening and their spiritual journey, there was a lot of messiness on the human level to their awakening and to their journey. Some of us come onto the spiritual path or the path of spiritual transformation, kicking and screaming against everything, trying to stay the way we were because it was familiar, and yet there is something pulling us up and out and forward on our own unique path. And oftentimes that can feel messy and sometimes dangerous. And I think there's a part of our psyche that longs for the neatness and the predictability of the inn, but we don't get born there. We wind up being born, opened up, if you will, into our spiritual essence, usually through something that's somewhat messy or somewhat dangerous or somewhat chaotic. Think about how many people start their spiritual journey because they've been walked up the side of the head with a cosmic 2x4, right? Awakened, and then the whole practice really is to learn basic principles and teachings and to use those to stay awake and not fall back asleep. And that's one of the values of being together in community, is we help one another to stay awake, to not fall back asleep. A third pointer is this, that our focus on our spiritual journey, our focus continues to shift from the outer to the inner. We deeply value the inner life. We deeply value turning within for inspiration and wisdom and guidance and direction. And you may or may not be aware of this, but it's quite symbolic in the Christmas story that we're told that the wise men came from the east and followed the star to Bethlehem. The idea of east in the Bible is significant mystically in that it refers to the inner. The East was believed to be the origin of the inner, the origin of wisdom. It's interesting to me that in our culture, we don't really think so much about the East. We think about true north, right? True north, pointing ourselves true north, but not so much. In the Bible, it was the East. So mystically, metaphorically, it is significant that the wise men came from the east. We value in our spiritual practice turning our attention within and seeking divine guidance and wisdom and inspiration from within. We talk about the inner teacher and listening to and for that inner teacher. We glibly say that we must go within or we will go without. We must go within or we will go without. Even the gifts that were brought to the baby Jesus, though not at all the kinds of gifts you would bring to a baby shower today, you would not bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Maybe you would bring something gold, but you probably wouldn't bring frankincense and myrrh. But even these are symbolic. And it's interesting sometime to poke around the internet or into Bible reference books and educate yourself on some of the meanings of these various symbols. They don't all agree on what the gold represented or what the frankincense represented or what the myrrh represented. But what they do agree is that these were common gifts given to recognize the nobility or specialness of the person that they were being given to. And so the fact that in this story we are being told that these wise men came and brought these very expensive gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh is a biblical writer's way of saying they recognized that they were in the presence of someone that was special. And so our attention shifts from the outer, moves into the inner, and I think we can look at the gifts that we have to bring forth in our own lives. What are the gifts that we bring forth? The gold in many of the Bible reference books represents our innate divinity. Are we not to live our lives as much as we possibly can from bringing forth our innate divinity? The frankincense is often used to represent the idea of prayer, the idea of consciousness, the fragrance of that. Are we not to bring our highest consciousness into every decision we make, every conversation we have, every word that we speak, every plan that we make? The myrrh was a perfume-like substance that was sometimes or oftentimes used in burial traditions and rituals. And it is suggested that element is about the idea of sanctifying or purifying. And boy, if we were to bring the energy of our pure heart, our sacred heart, into all of our interactions, would we too not see a whole different life, our life, being born anew and being born differently? Also from the story, the fourth point is the importance of being willing to be guided, to be shown the way. We're told in the story that the wise men followed what? They followed the star. They followed the star. You know, one of the beautiful things about going out to our retreat property in East County in Descanso is that far out, there's much less street lights and business lights and so forth. And in the evening, when you look up into the sky, you see the stars so bright and so beautiful. And to think about following what those wise men did, to follow that star, yes, that was a common means of navigating, but what does that represent in us? What are we following in our lives? Are we following something that is bright and beautiful and inspiring? Or are we allowing ourselves to be pulled down by that which is negative and discouraging and destructive? What are we following? And what does the star itself mean? A few weeks ago, one of our members said to me, "Gee, I hope that when you're doing your messages on the Christmas story that you'll speak a little bit about the star." And she was very passionate in asking me to do so. And I thought, well, there's got to be a story in this for her. I want to know what that is. And so I said, "Jane, why is the star so important to you?" And she shared a little bit with me about why it's so important. And she shared a quote with me that I want to share with you as well. But for her, the star was this idea of many of the stars that we see have long ago burnt out, but their light, because of the tremendous distance that we are from them, comes to us much later in time. And she had shared with me about the loss of a child, her child, and how she will still oftentimes think about how the light of his consciousness, his presence, his love still touches her life and guides her. And this was a piece she shared with me. "There are stars whose light reaches the earth only after they themselves have disintegrated and are no more. And there are people whose memory lights the world only after they have passed from it." I want to read that piece to you again. "There are stars whose light reaches the earth only after they themselves have disintegrated and are no more. And there are people whose memory lights the world only after they have passed from it." I would say that in many ways, Jesus' memory lights the world more today than it actually did when he physically walked the planet. And yes, there are many stories, many of which I don't believe, literally wrapped around him. But when you pull away the stories and you really try to get at the heart of what he taught, and you expose yourself to other gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, for example, you begin to peel back a lot of the stories and you begin to get much more to the essence of what he taught. And though it's doubtful that the essence of what he taught during his lifetime was really grasped in its fullness, I think it's being grasped more and more today over time. And I think that that is true because we as people are growing and evolving both intellectually but spiritually as well. Our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of each other, our knowledge of the way the brain works, the mind works, the heart works, is far more evolved than it was when he walked the planet. And so the ideas that he taught resonate with us, I think, because we have grown in consciousness to meet them and match them. In large part, he was crucified because the consciousness, yes, there was all the political, but in large part, the consciousness of his message was at such a higher vibrational level that was not yet matched en masse the way that kind of consciousness is being matched today. That's why we can look at or listen to or read the teachings of the Buddha or other enlightened masters and get it in a way that wasn't gotten long ago. Does that make sense? There's an evolution of consciousness to support that. And then lastly, the last point I want to share is the willingness to be redirected when we need to make a course change. You know, in a very simplistic way, sometimes in our practice of metaphysics, we set a goal, we visualize, and we know how important and powerful consciousness is, and setting goals and visualizing and so forth. And then we get on a plan, we create a plan, and we get so in love with the plan that we get more addicted to or attached to the plan, and we lose sight of where we were going to begin with. And we don't allow for any mid-course correction or redirection. The wise men needed to be redirected to help protect the baby from harm's way. And we're told in this story that they were told in a dream to go home a different way, to go home a different way. And I think that's an important piece for us to remember, that in our spiritual journey, and remember, if the path is clear, you're probably on somebody else's path, right? And even when we're on our own path, I think we need to remain spiritually, mentally, and emotionally fluid and flexible to be redirected when Spirit is really trying to get our attention and say, no, not here, make this mid-course change or redirect over here. And the only way I know to do that is to stay close to the source, to make room and time to listen to and to listen for that still small voice, and then to have the courage to act upon it. A community such as this can help you to feel that courage to act upon that guidance that you receive. Namaste.
Thanks for listening. The Unity Center, transforming lives and healing our world. Check us out Sundays at 9 and 11. Subscribe to our podcasts and download our free app for instant access to a wealth of spiritual teachings, services, and events.